Hello all, and welcome to the April 2021 Patch Tuesday webcast. We'll begin in just a few short moments, but before we do, I'd like to remind all attendees they are currently in listen-only mode, but please feel free to ask the panelists questions at any time, and we will answer them during the live Q&A session at the end. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Rob Brown.
Thank you, Heidi, and a very warm welcome to everybody today on the April Patch Tuesday. We're actually 2 months away from our 1-year anniversary, and I know we've really enjoyed delivering these webinars to you, covering both Microsoft third-party Linux and Mac OS. And as usual, I'm joined by 2 experts from my team today. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Rob. Hey everybody, my name is John Cassell, Solutions Architect with Syxsense. I am based in sunny Southern California. I've been working in IT for many years, specializing in desktop and server operations. And at Syxsense, I concentrate on customer implementation, onboarding, and training.
Thank you, John. And Pete, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, no problem, Rob. Hi, my name is Pete, everybody. I'm based in the chilly UK at the moment. I've worked for Syxsense as a pre-sales consultant for 6 years. Prior to my current role, I worked for an oil company where I managed a tool that at the time was called Landesk. The tool was used to manage around 4,500 devices. We used it for general asset management, software deployment, and of course, patch management. In my current role, amongst other things, I demo our Syxsense product to potential customers, and I also train or onboard those customers on all aspects of the product.
That's wonderful, Pete. Thank you. And once again, I'm Rob, the head of customer success, and one of the departments I manage is the patch management managed services, and over the last 10 years we've deployed over 100 million patches globally. So okay, so based on some feedback, we are running this webcast 50 to 55 minutes. I used to put some questions that we were sent ahead of time at the beginning of the webcast. We were asked to leave those to the end. But please use this opportunity to ask your questions now. If you have anything to do, any questions relating to anything that's in the news right now, if you have questions regarding a patching strategy or anything you think we can answer for you throughout this webcast, please send them through just on the chat. So in the news, since probably the biggest thing that we're aware of is that Microsoft released, which we actually notified you via this webcast last month, that KB 5000822 was causing some blue screen, stop screen messages when printing on Windows 10. And this actually didn't just stay with Windows 10. There was actually some of the same symptoms impacting the server operating system as well. And Microsoft released several updates for this patch to resolve these vulnerabilities. Only those updates also caused more of the same symptoms. Now this is very important when we talk about your patching strategy. One thing we learned from a lot of our prospects and clients that we onboarded since then is that Windows Update settings on your device, which can be managed from group policy, can overnight automatically deploy critical vulnerabilities. Now, when Microsoft released the update for this bad patch, they released it as an optional severity, which meant that if you uninstalled the bad patch, the one I mentioned, overnight, it would actually be reinstalled the next day. But the fix for that vulnerability was released as an optional severity, which means you weren't actually installing it in its default behavior. If you are using Windows Update and you want to you don't know how to turn Windows Update to not use that default behavior, please send us a message and we'll give you an article on how to disable the automatic installing of updates via Windows Update locally on your devices. So if you have a toolset, a premise toolset or a cloud patch management toolset, make sure you turn the automatic install off via group policy or from the device itself, so that your patches that are deployed are via your process. And that's something we have within our patching strategy documented for you. We also learned that the UK National Cyber Security Centre raised an alarm this week for Fortinet VPN. And what they're actually saying is that if you haven't patched your software, you probably have already been breached, which is very, very serious. So this is the NCSC here in the UK are saying that please make sure that you update this. They are seeing that their vulnerabilities are being weaponized, and there is a very serious and very obvious chance that you have been breached already. And also in the news, Windows 10 1909 reaches its end of life next month for Home and Pro editions. So if you're still using Windows 10 1909 and you haven't yet moved to the next feature update, you only have 1 month to do so. And with that, John, I know you've put some brilliant material together for third parties. Do you want to let us know what you've been working on?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Before going into the third-party patches, like always, want to mention that they are just as important as operating system updates to remedy potential vulnerabilities. Since last month, multiple updates have been released to resolve various issues. First, like typical, of course, Adobe released updates for various products for Windows and Mac OS since last month's webinar. There were 4 critical flaws detected in Adobe Bridge, as well as other critical and important severity bugs in Adobe Digital Editions, Photoshop, and RoboHelp. Adobe Bridge is a creative asset manager that helps users organize, edit, and publish multiple creative assets in a streamlined method. It contained 4 critical bugs, as well as 2 important vulnerabilities. These critical bugs are related to memory corruption issues and out-of-bounds write bugs, all potentially leading to arbitrary code execution. The important vulnerabilities are related to out-of-bounds read issues that could lead to information disclosure and improper authorization that could allow privilege escalation. In Adobe Photoshop, 2 critical vulnerabilities were resolved, both related to buffer overflow that could also allow arbitrary code execution. Adobe Digital Editions, a popular ebook reader software used for digital publications, was patched for a critical vulnerability related to privilege escalation problems as well, allowing for, of course, arbitrary file system rights. This update was specific only to Mac OS, didn't want to point that out, doesn't affect Windows. Lastly, Adobe patched 1 important rated vulnerability in RoboHelp, their help guide authoring software. This vulnerability is related to an uncontrolled search path element that could also allow privilege escalation. So if any of these products are being used in your organization, of course, be sure to update as soon as possible, or even set the applications to auto update in the Help tab. Google Chrome, and it's been an interesting few months for them as well. For any Chromium-based browsers, which I'll of course get to, they've received multiple version updates for Windows, Mac OS, and for Linux since last month, as well as resolving a 0-day vulnerability just yesterday. This is now the 3rd fix in 2021 that Google has rushed out related to in-the-wild 0-day attacks. According to their website, they were aware of reports that exploits for CVE 2021-21206 and 21220 exist in the wild. Both vulnerabilities do have a high severity, with one relating to use after free flaw in Blink, the Chromium rendering engine, and the other related to insufficient validation of untrusted input in the V8 JavaScript engine. So if those happen to apply, of course, get those pushed out as soon as possible, like normal. Most are set to auto update, but it depends on your policy and how you're currently managing, of course. The latest Chrome release, the latest Edge release, the latest Chrome release also affects other Chromium-based browsers, such as Microsoft Edge, which did follow suit by releasing an update immediately after regarding the same vulnerabilities. Edge has seen a similar amount of updates, of course, within the last month, of course, within the last year. However, this browser does typically self-update just like Chrome, but be sure to update and verify accordingly. Mozilla Firefox, as well as Thunderbird, have both received multiple updates since last month. Firefox version 86.0.1 was released just after our last webinar and included a number of fixes, including macOS sleep issues, Windows Zoom problems, and Linux crashes. The latest version, Firefox 87, was released later in March and offers new features as well as various security fixes. A number of accessibility fixes were resolved and some high and moderate vulnerabilities as well, related to out-of-band read, memory safety issues, and malicious extensions. Some of these fixes also apply to Firefox Extended Support release, version 78.9. So if you're running either of those, also be sure to upgrade. And then regarding Thunderbird, just like Firefox, typically they receive updates, of course, around the same time. Multiple versions have been released since last month. In late March, Thunderbird 78.9 included a number of fixes, as well as resolving some high and moderate vulnerabilities previously listed in Firefox 87, same ones. Additional fixes in Thunderbird resolved issues with notifications, the address book, and recurring tasks unable to be deleted from the calendar. And I actually experienced that firsthand, so I'm glad that was resolved. Thunderbird version 78.9.1 was released just last week and also resolved multiple moderate severity encryption vulnerabilities, as well as now supporting recipient aliases for OpenPGP encryption. Definitely last but not least, Wireshark version 3.4.4 was released last month, resolving a rather high severity vulnerability with a CVSS score of 8.8. This vulnerability exists in Wireshark versions 3.4 to 3.43 and versions 3.2 to 3.2.11, where improper URL handling could allow remote code execution via packet injection or crafted capture file, according to the National Vulnerability Database by NIST. If you're currently using Wireshark version 3.2 or newer, either way, I'd recommend to go ahead and update rather than focus on the specific sub-revisions. Just update. Be sure to upgrade as soon as possible, of course, to resolve this near critical vulnerability. Some additional products as well have seen updates since last Patch Tuesday. I'm going to list them all rather than just a few. Audacity, which I did actually want to first note, has reached version 3.0, replacing all previous versions for Windows, macOS, and Linux, as well as resolving over 160 bugs that have been accumulating over the years, according to their website. Also, Citrix received updates, Dropbox, FileZilla, Foxit Reader, Malwarebytes, Notepad++, Opera, RingCentral, Snagit, WebEx, WinRare, and Zoom. And of course, my monthly reminder to all administrators, always include third-party patching in the patch deployment process. It's not just about the operating system updates. Any application can be considered a major vulnerability if not updated regularly. So of course, it's better safe than sorry.
That's brilliant, John. Thank you very much. That's a huge list of third parties that you've detailed there. And if you do have any of those third parties, we do implore you to ensure that they are upgraded, and all of those are in Syxsense. Okay, so our topic this month is something very, very important. Specifically, if I circle back to the 5000802 vulnerability, it's the importance of reboots. And I know, Pete, you've been putting together this slide deck for us to walk us through the importance of reboots and obviously why they are needed. So would you like to get us started?
Yeah, no problem at all, Rob. Yep, so as Rob mentioned, today I'm going to give a quick talk about the importance of regular rebooting devices. I was just going to say first slide, please, Rob, but you beat me to it, so thank you. Okay, so reboots are required for several reasons with regards to patching devices. Many patches replace files as the actual patch installs. The problem is that quite often these files are locked either by a piece of software or by the actual operating system, and because of this, they cannot be overwritten with a newer file. The only time that the file is able to be overwritten is during the boot up of the actual device. Now, if a patch does not actually require the device to be rebooted, then you cannot, does require that the device is rebooted as it's installed, then you cannot consider that vulnerability to be remediated until after the reboot. In other words, the device is still vulnerable until the device is rebooted. A device that's in a pending reboot state can also be considered to be unstable or somewhat unstable. Therefore, many patches will refuse to install if the device is found to be in this state. The reason for this is to ensure that when the patch is actually installed, it's not damaged in some way by the subsequent reboot of that device, files getting overwritten, which it wasn't expecting to be overwritten, things like that. Okay, next slide, please, Rob. Okay, so one way that the operating system knows whether it has some actions to carry out on reboot is by looking in the pending file renamed operations area of the registry. That's a real mouthful. Be aware that on 64-bit devices, this entry can appear twice in the registry, once under the 32-bit area and once under the 64-bit area. As you can see on this slide, there are several actions to be carried out in this one area of the registry. That was actually my device, just opened up the registry a couple of days ago and spotted that I need a reboot. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, so if you're using an asset management tool to manage your devices, then one way of a better way than poking around in the registry is to actually make use of the tool, assuming that it actually brings this data back. You can see here I've drilled into the inventory for a particular device, and under there, then under the computer section, it says is reboot required, and it's set to true. So in other words, this device is actually pending a reboot. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, so making further use of an asset management tool, we can hopefully write a query in order to filter devices, in other words, find devices that require a reboot. We could then target these devices with a task that reboots these devices either with or without some end user control, i.e. the ability to cancel or postpone the reboot, that type of thing. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, so looking at reboots from a device point of view and understanding why a patch may refuse to install on it, may refuse to install on it that is pending a reboot, but without actually installing the patch that actually requires the reboot. Now, it can be useful to know which patches require a reboot, and again, if the tool that you're using to deploy patches stores this information, we can make use of this data. In the screenshot, you can see that KB4490628 actually does require a reboot before it's fully installed. One thing to be aware of is that even though this patch is marked down as requiring a reboot, it might actually not require a reboot on one device, but then does require a reboot if it's installed on another device. It all depends on the target device. It's not fully possible to predict how a device will react when the patch is installed. Now, for this reason, some people may decide to filter out patches that require a reboot from their deployment process. Again, if your tool allows you to do this, then clearly you can do that. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, so filtering out patches, here we go. In this screenshot, we can see a filter to find patches that require a reboot. When I took this screenshot a couple of days ago, it was 178 non-superseded patches that, if we're deployed, potentially would need a reboot on the device. Now, personally, I do not think that it's a good idea to exclude these patches from your patch deployment process. I think a better solution to do is include the patches if they meet the criteria of your patch deployment, so such as CVSS score, MS patch, things like that. You can then use a two-phased approach with regards to patch deployment. In other words, you can deploy the patches, but don't reboot the device at the end of the task. Instead, you can have a follow-up task or even include the logic in the deployment task, which basically checks whether the device is pending a reboot and only reboots the device if required. Okay, so that's my presentation. So back to you, Rob.
Thank you, Pete. This is brilliant. Now, there's been a few misconceptions around the requires a reboot setting. If you're using a vulnerability scanner, for example, it's looking for the patch being fully remediated, and if that does require a reboot and you're using a vulnerability scanning solution, it can still tell you that patches are needed, even though you look in your tool and you can see that the patches have been deployed. It's really, really important that if a reboot is needed, that a reboot is performed. And if you have, if we say, if you have patch management intelligence, a tool set that can detect if a reboot is needed, do a pre-reboot if it's needed, then patch and do a post-reboot, you'll get a lot more success in your patch management strategy. So that's brilliant, Pete. Thank you. Okay, so let's take a look at our patch Tuesdays for April. And if you've been here before, you know that there is actually more than one patch Tuesday in a month. There's actually 3 or maybe more. In the first week of this month, we had just one non-security Office update, which was for Microsoft Office 2016. And yesterday we had 114 security fixes, which we will go through with you very soon. 114 is back up above it's the most we've had this year, and we were really hoping that Microsoft sort of organized themselves better to not produce so many fixes. But with the list now back over 100, we have a lot of vulnerabilities to remediate this month. There wasn't any .NET Framework non-security updates in the 3rd week of March, but there was a preview update. Now, preview updates are unique, and I mentioned this last time, in that they are unsupported patches provided by Microsoft 1 month ahead. So if you install it, you do it at your own risk. If your device does have an issue, then you have to uninstall that patch, and that's as recommended by Microsoft. We have also had so many out-of-band updates since the March Patch Tuesday to fix those problematic updates. For Syxsense customers, we didn't actually put those patches into our content to be deployed, but we did leave them in our content so that you could detect what devices had installed those patches so that you could uninstall those patches. We also have one zero-day vulnerability, or what we classify as a zero-day vulnerability, in today's Patch Tuesday, and there is an advisory as well. So the advisory is related to the servicing stack, and last month we talked about a servicing stack that was released by Microsoft that got stuck at 30% and was causing a lot of issues. Servicing stacks cannot be uninstalled. This is actually quite a significant headache for IT departments. Because a servicing stack is critical in nature, it will appear in a vulnerability assessment. So you do need to make sure that you deploy them, and they are also prerequisites for the patches. They prepare the device ready for the patch itself. So if you're deploying your patches manually on your devices, you must make sure you install the servicing stack beforehand. Now, we learned at the beginning of this year that Microsoft had intended to include the servicing stack in cumulative updates for Windows 10 2004 onwards. So as long as you had the September of last year's servicing stack installed, servicing stacks would form part of the patch, which is great. We thought this was brilliant until last month, when those servicing stacks got stuck at 30%, rendering the device useless and requiring a restore. Never has testing servicing stacks been more important in your patch management strategy. Please make sure you are testing those servicing stacks. And we do recommend virtual devices. They are excellent to start your patch testing, but servicing stacks are also related to hardware. So if you have a Dell, a HP, a Lenovo device, please make sure that as part of your extended testing that you are doing service stack testing on that hardware. It really does make a difference. identifying issues before you do a site-wide rollout. Okay, let's talk about how we're going to prioritize Patch Tuesday. We have a unique priority for our content. We don't just recommend all the vendor severity because we do know better. So we use the vendor severity as one way of ranking the Patch Tuesday content. Vendor severity, of course, is from critical all the way down to NA. We use the NIST recommended CVSS score as well. So that's a score that's from 10 to 0, 10 being the worst, 0 being not too risky. We also use the weaponized status. The weaponized status is the exploit status of that vulnerability. Is the vendor aware, or has the industry been told that there is a vulnerability being weaponized, and there is in fact one in this Patch Tuesday? Weaponized is very, very serious. If you see a vulnerability that is weaponized, that doesn't necessarily have to have a high vendor severity or CVSS score. Of course, it takes priority. So that's why we have that as one form of our prioritization. Public aware doesn't mean the patch. It means the vulnerability, the precise method to expose that vulnerability is available. These are found via bug bounty programs, and those bug bounty programs offer the vendor to pay a bug bounty, and if they don't, they can make the source of that vulnerability public on the internet. So when a public aware vulnerability is found, it means you can effectively use that to expose it, and it's very, very serious. You have some time from public aware before it becomes weaponized. So when you do see a public aware vulnerability, please prioritize it. You sometimes only have a week before something that is public becomes weaponized. So it's really important that you patch it. We have countermeasures. So we need a way of balancing our priority. So we use countermeasures. Countermeasures are in two types. We have a workaround and a mitigation. So we might be mitigated by a next generation antivirus or a firewall on our devices, but we could also have a workaround where we might use group policy, for example, to apply something that negates the need for the patch. Obviously, some of these patches are very, very large. Some of the Windows Server patches that we have in our list today is 1.7 to 1.8 gigabytes in size. And that can be very difficult to deploy in a highly distributed environment. But if you can set a registry key or a group policy, you can effectively get around the need to deploy the patch. We do recommend you deploy the patch anyway, but the speed in which you deploy it can obviously be tailored. The last thing we have in our priority today is your exposure. So how much of these vulnerabilities are exposed in your environment? If you're a Syxsense customer, we calculate all these together into a 6 score. If you don't worry. We give you the CVEs which are the highest risk, and then all you have to do is put those CVEs into your tool set and deploy the ones that we recommend from that list. Now we have all of our content up on our site already. It was published last night. I do have a few extra updates though from some research we've been looking at since we published it. So if you go to syxsense.com/news or /Patch Tuesday, what we have here is all of our patches appear under this news page. So we have a news page with all of our content, and we do have a specific page for Patch Tuesday. This is where I mentioned if you have a patching strategy, but you'd like to know what patching strategy you could use, or you don't have a patching strategy, download this here from this link, and you can start talking to us about a strategy. If you have questions, use the chat feature in the bottom right corner. And if you're not a Syxsense customer but you'd like to see how we can help, there is a free trial button there to use. And here is all of the content we've created. We try to create content every few days based on what is happening in the industry, not just for Microsoft, but for Linux and third parties as well. Now, if you go to the top, as I mentioned, and then use Patch Tuesday, it takes you straight to the Patch Tuesday articles. Here is the one from yesterday. You don't have to come here every single month. You can subscribe. So if you subscribe using this section here, we'll pop you an email every time we put up one of these articles, and you can read that straight from your mailbox. Now, of all of the vulnerabilities we had yesterday, 19 are critical and 88 important. As I said, this is the largest Patch Tuesday so far of 2021, and it pretty much fixes everything from Microsoft Windows all the way to Exchange. And we are going to talk about one of those Exchange vulnerabilities. But what's more important, I want to mention, is Year 2 extended support. Now, if you're using Windows 7 or Windows 2008 R2, and you have subscribed to the second year, you have the largest list of vulnerabilities released since mainstream support ended back in 2020. For Windows 7, you have 14 critical vulnerabilities and 34 important vulnerabilities fixed. And if you're using Windows 2008 R2, you've got 14 critical and 33 important vulnerabilities fixed. That's a significant increase over every. I think that's probably the most vulnerabilities fixed for the whole year. I might be wrong. I think there were 1 or 2 patches in it, but in 1 month they've released as many as they've fixed in the entire year. It's very, very serious. If you have those 2, then please make sure you do your patching for those. Then the 3 I've recommended, and John and Pete, you have yours as well, but I'd like to start off by talking about my top pick. The top vulnerability for this month, in my opinion, is 2021 28310. Now this is the Win32k elevation of privilege vulnerability. This bug allows an attacker to escalate privileges by running a specially crafted program on a target system. But what's interesting is this was found by an antivirus company, a very popular antivirus company. So probably this weaponized vulnerability is probably malware. Which is obviously the most serious of threats. This is interesting because the vendor give the severity an important score, and the CVSS gave it a 7.8, so not really super uber high, but because we don't just take those 2 factors into consideration, we do take its weaponized status into consideration. It is my highest priority for this Patch Tuesday. Now, if we talk about the risk of this, so you are aware, its attack vector is local, which means you need to actually get to the device in order to exploit it. But its attack complexity is low, with low privileges, no user interaction at all. So if you can get onto that system with low privileges and no user interaction, you can cause an issue. And that's very, 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 very serious. My second one is 28480, and that is a Microsoft Exchange. Now, we've had Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities already this year. In fact, the 2 vulnerabilities that were exploited earlier this year had a lower CVSS score than this one. This has a CVSS score of 9.8. It is not at the moment weaponized or public aware, but what I've been reading is that this is suspected to be wormable. So if they can get into one Exchange system, they can potentially jump into another Exchange box if you have more than one in your environment. What is interesting is that this attack vector is network based. So any network can be used to exploit this vulnerability with low complexity, no privileges, and no user interaction. So this is very, very serious. And lastly today is CVE 2021-27091. This is an RPC endpoint mapper service. Now, once again, this one is prioritized because it's public aware. Now, I just want to mention, if you're not sure what this RPC endpoint manager service does, it's used by Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008. As I said, it was interesting that there were many, many vulnerabilities resolved for these operating systems. The RPC endpoint mapper service effectively resolves RPC interface identifiers, which are remotely callable operations to Windows to do different things. So disk management, for example, is one of those things that's an example of what RPC is used for. If it is able to be exploited, it can stop your device from operating. It might not actually load. So if you are exploited with this particular vulnerability, there's a serious issue to your device. You may actually need to restore it or reinstall Windows in order to get around the vulnerability. So very, very serious. Has a CVSS score of 7.8, as I mentioned. Its risk alert, its risk is has to be exploited on the device, but it can be done with low attack complexity, low privileges, and no user interaction. So very, very serious, and actually quite easy to exploit if you can get inside your network. Now, as I mentioned, all of the 6 factors that we use, we've already calculated it for you. We have a Syxsense recommended column, so this is our highest priority. We understand not every one is able to deploy every patch, and if you have to be selective in which patches you deploy because of their size or your distribution around the world, then please make sure that you target the ones at the top of this list above the others, if you so choose to take our advice. And we put the CVSS score, the fact if it's public aware, its weaponized status, and those countermeasures. If there is a countermeasure there, we put it here as yes. And no countermeasures actually exist in this Patch Tuesday so far. So, John, would you like to give us one of your, sorry, I don't know if you have one recommendation for us?
I have one, yeah. The update I have is to resolve CVE 2021-27095.
Okay, let's have a look what that is.
Perfect. Yep, Windows Media Video Decoder Remote Code Execution Vulnerability. That is a handful. The vulnerability exists due to improper input validation in the Windows Media Video Decoder. A remote attacker can trick a victim to open a specially crafted file and execute arbitrary code on the target system. Successful exploitation of this vulnerability may result in complete compromise of the vulnerable system. Can this be exploited remotely? Yes, this vulnerability can be exploited by a remote authenticated user via the internet. This has a CVSS score of 7.8. I believe the vendor score is critical. Our 6 score risk alert. It has a local attack vector, low attack complexity, no privileges required. User interaction is required. So in a web-based attack scenario, an attacker could host a website or leverage a compromised website that accepts or hosts user-provided content that contains a specially crafted file that is designed to exploit the vulnerability. But this does not, an exploited vulnerability such as this can only affect resources managed by the same security authority.
That's excellent, John, thank you. I think we may have had last year a public aware or weaponized vulnerability with Windows Media, obviously with everyone working remotely. People are using videos and other types of content, especially from SharePoint, more than ever before. So that's a brilliant selection. Thank you, Pete. You have one for us as well.
I do, Rob. Thank you very much. Yeah, so mine, the vulnerability I spotted this month is CVE 2021 23829. So I'll just let you find that.
23839.
Sorry, I'm so dyslexic. 28329. Good work in IT, hey, with all these figures. There we go. Great, thanks. And I'm very pleased to note that I've beat John's CVSS score again. I think it was around the 7s. This has a CVS score of 8.8, which is classed as important in the CVSS scoring system. The CVE describes a vulnerability in the remote procedure call runtime. A remotely authenticated attacker can send a specially crafted request and execute arbitrary code on the target device. The vulnerability is present on all Windows operating systems from 32-bit Windows 7 all the way up to Server 2016, and there are several patches available to remediate this vulnerability. Interestingly, this is one of the few examples where the patch vendor, in this case Microsoft, has given the patches a higher severity score than CVSS. Obviously, CVSS could vary at some point in the future, though. Microsoft have rated the patches as critical. CVSS has rated them as important. The attack complexity is classed as low. The privileges required are also low, and the attack can be carried out via a network connection. So, you know, reasonably important. It's worth keeping an eye out for that one.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, guys, for those selections. That's really good. As I mentioned, all of the vulnerabilities from Patch Tuesday have been reviewed, and we've assessed them across, as I said we did. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the issues. Now, my team do substantial testing before adding content into Syxsense. That's how we were able to find those issues with the Windows 10 printing last month. They haven't found any issues so far this month, which is great. But there are these regular issues that Microsoft put onto their site, so we feel it's important to show you just for transparency. If you're using Windows 7 and Windows 2008 R2, when you are using clustered share volumes, certain operations may fail. Please make sure you do extra testing. That's probably been there about 6 months now. They haven't actually fixed it yet. And this one also for Windows 10, if you haven't applied the latest servicing stack and you do install an update, you may lose your user certificates. It's just essential that you apply the servicing stack before the patches. And if you have Japanese systems, you may have an issue with the input method editor. They are still working on a solution. So unfortunately, we are no nearer a solution for that. So we got some news on the feature update support. John, do you want to just walk us through quite quickly what customers should be planning ahead in their feature update lifecycle?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. And there are actually 3 slides. So the first one that we're looking at here is related to the consumer versions, Home and Pro. And as mentioned on previous webinars, these do get a shorter life cycle. They're called consumer versions because they're not meant to last as long. Do want to point out that Windows 10 Pro version 1909 will be losing support in approximately 1 month. Fortunately, the first round of updates missed will occur actually in June of this year. So the date, the end of life date is the last date you'll receive updates. The month after that, and of course, it's not even the next month, you may receive, I should say not receive updates just a few weeks after, since there's not just one Patch Tuesday. But again, it will be 1 month after that you'll stop receiving those updates. I would still recommend to think about moving to a newer version such as 2004 or the latest 20H2 to extend that device lifecycle. Next slide, please, Rob. And then for the enterprise editions, these, of course, we've seen a lot of changes in the past year due to the pandemic. A number of versions were extended. A number of them have already been marked as obsolete, even though they were already extended an extra 6 months. But one of them is coming up. Both Windows 10 Enterprise versions 1803 and 1809 are both set to hit end of life in 1 month, just like 1909, same Patch Tuesday. If you're still using these versions, however, of course, expect it if you're using Enterprise Business Editions, you probably had them much longer than you would a Pro Edition, for example. You want to upgrade these as soon as possible to ensure you're going to be receiving, of course, the latest updates. Fortunately, again, first round of updates missed will occur actually in June. However, it's definitely best to formulate a plan rather than wait till the last minute. But on that note, Windows 10 Enterprise version 1903, which as we see listed in red, and it is the next consecutive version after the 1803 and 1809 versions, it's already received end of life because it's one of the very first versions where it's standardized to have that same end of life date, no matter whether you're using Pro or Enterprise. And this is because this has an 18-month life cycle, so you'll definitely want to look to version 1909, which, as you see based on the list, will have an extra year for Enterprise going well into May 2022, or of course go the latest version 20H2. At this time, I wouldn't recommend going to the consecutive version of 2004 for Enterprise, as it will lose support quicker just at the end of this year. Just like 1903, 2004 also only lasts 18 months, and it's already been out for almost a year. Next slide, please, Rob. And then there's long-term support. No changes expected here. We did have a date much earlier this year. Oh, I'm sorry, insurance support for, yeah, October. So I'm sorry. There was already a change earlier this year. This year in October, we will see a change for the 2016 long-term service branch. That will be in October, but that is for mainstream support, of course. For point of using long-term is that you have plenty of years left with the extended support dates. I did also want to point out that the next version of Windows 10, version 21H1, should be dropping fairly soon, as we are now clearly in spring. If Microsoft follows suit with their previous spring releases, it will only receive, again, 18 months of support until it will no longer receive those latest security updates. The same thing we saw with 1903, 2004, and now with 21H1. So no matter whether you're using consumer or enterprise editions, again, it's only going to have that amount of support. If you're antsy to upgrade, just bear in mind that, again, you will receive an extra 6 months with enterprise if you do decide to stay on 20H2 instead, rather than moving to the latest. Of course, go test it out. It's totally up to you. But no matter whether you're using consumer or business editions, they're going to have the same end of life for the next Windows version.
That's brilliant, John. Thank you. I think we've got some Linux of the month. We have a few minutes left before we go to questions. Let's see what we've got. So again, we don't put the Linux vulnerabilities here in the slide deck. We actually do post those directly to our site. So back to syxsense.com/news, and if you bring up the vulnerabilities for April, you'll see we've got 5 that we're suggesting be prioritized. John, do you want to just walk us through this quick?
Yeah, absolutely. And a number of these are actually general Linux kernel vulnerabilities, so there are only a few here that are specific to distributions. The first one, Nettle signature verification vulnerability affecting Rail 8. This does have a severity of critical from the vendor, as well as a CVSS score of 9.8, and that again is extremely high. Exploiting this vulnerability, an attacker can force an invalid signature and cause an assertion failure or possible validation. The highest threat to this vulnerability is to confidentiality and, of course, system availability. And you're welcome to go onto the website and view the rest of the attack vector details. The iSCSI data structure vulnerability in Linux kernels, this has a severity of important and a CVSS of 7.8. This is a flaw in the Linux kernel which allows an unprivileged attacker to send netlink messages associated with iSCSI with the maximal length. As particular iSCSI data structures do not have appropriate length constraints or checks, and the page size value can be exceeded. The highest threat from this vulnerability is to data confidentiality and integrity, as well as system availability. The next patch, vulnerability, is in the LIBI-SCSI module flaw. I'll just list the whole thing out rather than attempt to say that as one word. This has a severity of important, CVSS score of 7.1. This vulnerability is an out-of-bands read in that particular module, which allows an unprivileged attacker to read kernel memory or crash the system through crafting netlink messages. Again, the highest threat from this vulnerability is to data confidentiality, as well as system availability. The next vulnerability, the AF VSOC wrong locking flaw. This has a vendor severity of important, CVSS score from the industry of 7.0. This Linux kernel flaw is a wrong locking in the AF VSOC socket, which can result in local privilege escalation in case of bypassing SMAP or SMAP. Lastly, a pointer flaw in the Linux kernel only has a severity of moderate and a CVSS score of 4.4, but given that this is a general vulnerability, I wanted to highlight it. This is a kernel pointer leak in the Linux kernel through version 5.11.3. It can be exploited to detect the address of the iSCSI transport structure and allow access to the transports handled to an unprivileged local user via the SYSFS file system. Besides using this vulnerability, an attacker can end arbitrary iSCSI connections on the system. So using Linux in general, of course, take a look at these vulnerabilities. Definitely make sure, just like I mentioned in every other spiel of mine, make sure you're updated as soon as possible.
That's
brilliant.
brilliant.
And
Yep.
I don't believe we have a Mac slide, but I did find some additional information for Mac devices. Fortunately, Mac OS don't really have any just yet. So there haven't really been any patches or anything
That's
really
no
to highlight. Since last month, again, there haven't really been any new system updates, but I did want to highlight a few just for Apple devices in general. With that being said, they did release updates on March 26th for iOS and watchOS regarding a medium severity, potentially actively exploited vulnerability where processing maliciously crafted web content may lead to universal cross-site scripting. This vulnerability is referenced as CVE 2021-1879 and currently has an industry CVSS score of 6.1. Apple did also release, I thought this was kind of interesting just to highlight it, they did release an update earlier this month for GarageBand on specifically macOS Big Sur. It appears to contain stability improvements, but they did list in plain text on their site security updates. But when you go and look up the update, they said they had stated that additional details will be coming soon. So I'm going to be on the lookout for that particular update and see what that means.
They do sometimes put messaging like that on their site saying that there is a security vulnerability, but we're not going to tell you what the vulnerability is until they confirm it, and they never get round to. So that's brilliant, John. Thank you so much. In case I didn't mention it before, anything from the Microsoft Patch Tuesday or from this Linux, you just take the CVE from here, pop it into your tool set if you're using Syxsense, pop that into your patch manager, and it will tell you all of the devices that need those vulnerabilities. So, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. I think that's probably it. We've got a few minutes left. Heidi, have we been sent any questions
we do.
for today?
Yeah, absolutely. We have several. The first one I'm going to go with is, how can I stop a patch from rebooting a device when the patch requires that the device is rebooted?
I guess that one's aimed at me as I was talking about reboots. So I can only really talk about our Syxsense product, but the way that we handle that is with any patch that we put into our product on the command line, when we're delivering the exe, the MSU file, whatever it happens to be, we put the switch options in to suppress the reboot. So in other words, what we're actually deploying cannot cause a reboot, even if it wants to reboot the device. We then control the reboot using the task itself, and that gives us much more options. We can put a user-facing message up there saying, hey, reboot's required, things like that. Now, when you create the task, if the patch requires a reboot, there is a little flag that says, hey, what you're trying to deploy does need a reboot. You can then choose at that time, well, I'm going to reboot later, or I'll get this task to actually carry out the reboot now. So that's the way that we deal with that.
Yeah, and if anyone is concerned about the Windows Update setting I mentioned earlier, the Windows Update setting has reboot behavior within it as well. And potentially your Windows Update reboot behavior can override some other systems management tools, patch management tools as well. If you need some help, please pop a message on the chat, and we'll send you the document we're creating for that. So it will walk you through group policy, and it will walk you through local policies as well on how to make sure that your machines reboot when you want them to, not randomly.
Helpful, Rob. Thank you. Another audience question is, how do we know what KB number these patches are?
So the KBs are the patches themselves, and if you, with the reason why we use the CVE, which is the universal ID for the vulnerability, you simply put the CVE into your tool set, and it should tell you what KBs are to be deployed for those vulnerabilities. What you find is that sometimes there's a lot of CVEs covered inside one single KB patch. So that's why we list them out as at the CVE level instead of the KB level.
And I guess it's true as well, Rob, that a CVE can contain several KBs.
That's correct, it can.
Yeah.
It's done so for efficiency.
Great, that was a great question. Next question is, can a Windows 10 feature update version be skipped?
That's you, John.
It certainly can. There's maybe some versions you might want to stick to go consecutive, which you can do through really any tool. And it's all based on the life cycle. So I always recommend before you even think about upgrading, take a look at the chart. Microsoft always keeps it up to date. I actually sometimes prefer just going to the Wikipedia page because it's color coded and easy to read, but make sure you check the dates first. They can be skipped. It's dependent on the deployment mechanism. Popular method of deploying out new feature versions is to instead deliver the full Windows 10 ISO. And delivering that ISO can be a feature version, maybe a few versions newer, and skipping those interim versions because what you're actually doing is deploying all the content locally, supplying that full payload, mounting it as Microsoft Windows 7 and 10 and actually versions of 8 all support, mount the ISO and run a full upgrade, which does allow you to skip versions. Just expect that it's going to take longer, and just like anything with regard to change control, you're introducing a lot more changes, so actually potential for more issues. So always test first.
Hey John, I believe the ISOs are generally over 4 gig, aren't they, in size? So
they are very large.
Yeah. So because of the size of it, that's where all the files are technically coming from. So you're not really dependent much on a direct channel of the internet. You just download the full payload, get the full ISO. That's where the files are technically being delivered from.
Yeah, I guess if you can drip feed that ISO down and just store it on the devices, you can sort of pre-stage an upgrade, that type of thing. So that's would be one way of appearing to make it look like it's all happened very quickly, but you've actually been pushing the ISO for weeks beforehand.
Actually, another point to that, Rob mentioned earlier as well, the servicing stack updates also be very aware of because they are a prerequisite to deploying later content. So I would recommend, at least bare minimum, make sure the machine is fully patched before you decide to go ahead and skip a version. But again, make sure you're watching the chart. Odds are the next consecutive version might actually be the better version for you to go with, rather than going and skipping a version. The only versions you may want to skip would probably only be spring release, but that's up to you.
Great, thank you. And there are a few more questions, but we've ran out of time, so we will reply to those personally. And then if anybody has any future questions, you could always pop over to our website chat. I'm on there, I'll say hi, and we'll get your questions answered.
That's
Great.
brilliant. Thank you, Heidi. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope you have a good month for deploying, and we really look forward to seeing you back in May. Thanks very much.
Catch you all later. Bye.
Bye.